Good morning. Thanks for coming. I'd like to make this as much of a conversation as possible, so I pause a few points during the conversation and certainly ask some questions. Before we get started, though, I have to mention, coming from the United States, I'm as concerned for American democracy as I've ever been. The assaults on the judiciary, on the press, on universities, and on science are unprecedented. Haven't seen anything like it. Matter of fact, we learned over the weekend that our own research had been defunded by the National Science Foundation on exactly this project. So I know perhaps one of the conclusions is we must be doing something right. But if you have any thoughts on that, we'd love to talk to you afterwards. On a lighter note, beginning the main conversation, I think this problem is solvable. I'd like to give the optimistic idea that I actually now believe it is possible to reduce the flow of misinformation with no censorship at all and no central authority judging truth. The way I want to do this, I want to give you first a theoretical approach as to how we might go about solving this problem. And then I want to give you the evidence that maybe, just possibly, this new approach to solving the problem might actually work. So we're going through two different sets of ideas to do it. Before we do that, I just want to set the context. Misinformation has been indicted in a number of different activities, such as the election or the insurrection that took place on January 6th in the United States. It's also the insurrection that took place in Brazil almost exactly a year later. Or perhaps even the UK riots that happened here when an immigrant was falsely implicated for stabbing children when in fact it was a UK citizen. Matter of fact, the Rohingya had been massacred, also on false claims of a Muslim takeover, as another instance of the nature of the problem. These misinformation has effectively been implicated in insurrections, riots, lynching, money laundering, suicide, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, child exploitation, judicial intimidation, terrorist recruiting. Yuval Noah Harari asks this wonderful question: if social media are bringing us together, why is everyone so angry? What's happening? There was a wonderful study that summarized the various misinformation approaches almost exactly a year ago, so I have to give the credit to the authors there. It was Kozreva et al. They talk about accuracy prompts, debunking, friction, inoculation, media literacy tips, social norms, credibility, warning, fact-checking labels. I want to argue that almost all of the tools that we have serious challenges to them. So this is a list of everything I've been able to find. If there's anything missing from the list, please let me know. But I'm going to argue that the tools and the approaches that we've been taking suffer from at least one, if not more, of one of four separate and fairly deep problems with all of these different solutions. The technological solutions almost universally suffer from what I call the arms race problem. All right, this is the first one over here. If you're going to use a filter or a technology to recognize a problem, then you can use a filter or technology to recognize recognition and in order to avoid it. The second one is what I would call the discredit the rater problem. If the person's going to lie in the first place, then they're going to lie about the people that are fact-checking them and simply seek to discredit them, whether that's the press, the scientist, or any other such mechanism. The third one, I think, is actually more problematic, and I think this is underappreciated, because I think most of these solutions put responsibility on the wrong foot. In effect, we're taking what has traditionally been this marketplace of ideas solution, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Now, what's interesting is that who should be the party first responsible for the certification of a message? I would argue it's the author of the message. They know if they've created the deepfake. They know the composition of the message. If you see it as a pollution problem, one of the interesting nuances of our current approaches is that almost all approaches ask us, we, the citizens, to wear gas masks as opposed to asking the factories to stop polluting the air and the water. So the social costs are overwhelming in the kinds of solution approaches that we've been taking so far. And the last one is a problem that not a single solution I'm aware of addresses, not one. None of them change the cost structure such that it is cheaper to produce honest journalism than it is to create fake news. How do we address these problems? One of the issues I'm going to argue is we put perhaps too much emphasis on the fakeness of the misinformation rather than other attributes. There are any number of cases when the fakeness itself doesn't matter to the context. So, for example, is an ad an exaggeration? What about irony or parody? Fake news that's disbelieved is not a problem. A funny observation from George Carlin was, well, with respect to global warming, the planet's going to be fine. The people, they're effed. Right? George Carlin is actually using that as irony to draw attention to get better decisions and not worse ones. Okay? Or I can use true information to actually mislead you. So Russia used truth to suppress votes in the United States elections. Or a lot of the anti-vaxxers will use two truths to mislead you so they could claim accurately Colin Powell took the vaccine and died of COVID, didn't matter. They omit the fact that he had blood cancer and probably would have died from a cold or sniffles regardless. Or this is a wonderful one, I got to give credit to Jennifer Allen and her team. They pointed out, this was one of the most viral headlines on Facebook. It's completely true. Healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine, CDC investigating, Chicago Tribune headline. And what happened was it was a stomach problem that had nothing to do with COVID and nothing to do with the vaccine. So this true information was the issue. I would argue that one of the missing elements in the framing is externalities. This is damage that occurs off the platform, whether that's a pizza parlor shooting or clickbait claiming there are clear worms in Dasani water so that the FTC and Coca-Cola both have to issue a joint statement to protect it, or Salman Rushdie getting stabbed in the eye from someone radicalized online who hasn't even read his works. Or maybe it's the loss of herd immunity for COVID. We now have measles outbreaks in Texas that are the worst in 50 years because of misinformation. Or maybe it's inaction on global warming, or maybe it's insurrection. When you see the problem as an externality, it introduces a new way of seeing the problem. Externalities create market failures. Market failures require intervention. Most governments can't intervene in speech. In the United States, it's illegal under the First Amendment. What does this mean? I'll give you two. The first implication is that we're getting too much pollution. That is, no one is internalizing the pollution costs. Under Section 230 in the United States, not only your platform is not responsible, but really they're not responsible even for the editorial content or decisions they make. And it's really hard to go after individuals. So we're getting too much pollution, so no one's internalizing those costs. The second element is we're getting too little correction. For the simple reason, attempts by courts to use the marketplace of ideas will fail because markets do not self-correct market failures. I offer this as description, explanation, and possibly as resolution. So this description of the problem, but it also implies why it's so bad now as opposed to previously. If you are an editor for a journal or a TV broadcast, you can personally be held liable. But once social media around, and everybody's a journalist, and nobody's internalizing the cost, we are getting an excess of pollution. How do we solve the pollution problem? Economics gives us two possible solutions. The first of these, invented here. The British economist, Arthur Pigou, has a really interesting idea. So what do we do in a factory effluent case? Right? The factory is polluting the air or the water. Well, you can do one of two things. One, you can tax the sales, which pulls down the amount of mud, or you can put a quota on the volume. Once you see it that way, you see why it's so problematic. Government can't do it because a quota on speech is censorship. We can't use Pigovian solutions to go after this pollution problem. There's another set of ideas. The other set of ideas for addressing pollution problems are due to Ronald Coase, for which half the reason for which he won the Nobel Prize. Right? He deals with negative externalities. This is a missing market in the harms. Is there some way that you could trade that missing marketplace? In his context, the original insight was interfering radio spectrum. One tower increases its signal, creating noise for the other, so it increases its signal, so the other increases its signal, and they interfere and they create noise pollution. The solution is not for the government to say, you can broadcast and you cannot. The solution is to create property rights in the externality so the best use case wins simply by buying it and it's traded in the marketplace. So here's the problem. How do we create a property right in a negative externality, the essential essence of which is misinformation? That's the tough stepping stone. That's the theory. We then need to ask the question, what is the scarce resource? If we're trying to get clean air or clean water, What is the scarce resource in this context? Another solution. What is it that information consumes? There's a wonderful observation by Herb Simon that points out what information consumes is obvious. The attention of the recipients. The wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. So let's apply Coase to Simon and see if we can develop something that might work. So here's my interpretation of a way to do this. Again, this is the theoretical portion before we move into the implementation portion. So what I want to do is I want to increase your own rights, not decrease, but increase your own rights. Proposition number one is that as a listener, you get to choose your own information sources in order to clean up your own polluted information streams. The way this would be operationalized would be on a platform like Facebook, Twitter X, TikTok, what have you. You get to choose your own filter. You could choose BBC. You could choose New York Times. You could choose Breitbart. You could choose Fox, as you wish. The obvious downside is the potential misuse through filter bubbles. How do we address this? I also want to increase your speaker's rights. I want to give you the ability to be heard. Now, interestingly enough, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a country on earth that currently gives you the right to be heard. In the United States, you have a right to speak. You do not have a right to be heard. Matter of fact, there's even an aphorism. You have a right to speech, but not to reach. I'd like to give you that right, but under certain conditions. Notice, by the way, this right, too, can be abused. Why? You can misuse it because you can lie to other people in order to influence them in one way or another. This creates a balancing act. How do we balance the right not to hear against the right to be heard? My argument is to borrow from Coase. We're going to say, fine, I will grant you the right to be heard even by someone that doesn't want to hear you, conditional on accepting liability for misuse of your right. Okay? That's the theory. Stop there. We're going to then move into operationalization. So the question will be what implementation might actually work. I'll give you a simple illustration of implementation, then I'm going to give you some empirical evidence. So one implementation might be, suppose you wanted to reach and pierce a filter bubble, and you escrowed 3 times the normal ad price. If you're telling the truth, after 3 weeks no one's challenged you, you simply get it back. So it was free if you were telling the truth. If you're lying, you're better off trying an ad because it's going to be 3 times as expensive. Now you have to make a choice as the author, the person creating the deep fake. Geez, if I know I'm lying, well, then I'd rather take out the ad. If I'm going to be telling the truth, I can vouchsafe that and get my warrant back. That's a potential mechanism. We tested it. So here's what we tried. These are 3 pre-registered experiments. I'm going to give you the data on it. I have to give credit also to my co-authors in helping to implement this possible version of the study. So this is the Truth is Warranted papers, the impact of self-certification on misinformation. The way we so this is a study. So I'm not sure the fonts are readable. Maybe the guys in the front rows can actually confirm for the back rows my claims so that it's not fake news. But this is 1,500 responses distributed across Democrats, Independents, Republicans, genders. They passed the attention checks. It was 1,500 responses, 29,000 responses overall. And what we did is we presented headlines and asked them their willingness to share under 3 separate conditions. And all of these are 20 different headlines, equally partitioned between half-half true-false, and that's then split half-half boring and interesting. So we pre-tested all of these, fact-checked all of the boring, interesting, true-false, so it's a quarter each. All right? Within this, you're then given the option to share, so they were actually sharing and not just intention to share, and we would reward them 5 cents for an interesting article, but penalize them 5 cents for a boring article, or you could do nothing and earn nothing. We then gave you the accuracy nudge version of the same thing. We just remind you if it's true or false, but it's the same payoff. So if it's boring, you're going to be penalized 5 cents. If it's interesting, you're going to be winning 5 cents. And either way, it's the same thing, but we're just reminding you that it's true or false. Again, this is analogous to a social media condition where you're being rewarded with likes and followers for sharing interesting content. The third condition is the binding one. This is the one where if you vouchsafe false information, that's going to cost you. That's going to cost you a dime, 10 cents. If you vouchsafe true information, you're going to be rewarded with a dime. So this one's binding in a way that the others are not. But here's what we found. The yellow is falsity, the blue is truth. The first bar is the amount of falsity shared relative to truth. And unsurprisingly, folks are sharing interesting false content. So that's more false than true. The middle condition is one in which you significantly increase the rate at which truth is shared, but we didn't actually much decrease the falsity. The discernment to no effect on the falsity. What's interesting and wonderful from our experimental perspective is that the binding condition had a dramatic increase on the actual sharing of truth. A dramatic increase, and it had a dramatic decrease in the sharing of false information. Notice again, this is entirely voluntary. You had each of the options. So you could have shared and not warranted. You could have shared not at all. And you can simply share the interesting information. But this is a very big difference in terms of the actual discernment. We then ran the study, so that's the signaling side. That's on the source of the information. How do people perceive the messages after they've received them? We reran this experiment on the other side to ask if these have been warranted, would you rate them as more or less accurate? So this had 2,000 participants, 48,000 responses, again distributed across Democrats, Republicans, Independents, what have you. And you're asked to rate one of these headlines. Not at all accurate is 1, unsure or neutral is 4, and completely accurate is 7. And then they're labeled with no label. You're informed if it was shared, and then there are these 2 warranted conditions. One is the cost less, where it's just staking your reputation, and the other is the costly warrant, where you're actually being penalized if you're sharing falsity. How did people respond? Well, the good news again, yellow is false and blue is true. The good news is, of course, well, folks got it right. So they perceived the true as true, and they perceived the false as false. So that's the control where there were no labels. If folks learned that it had shared, no effect. Didn't affect the sharing of truth or falsity. Simply learning that others had repropagated the information didn't make a difference. Putting your reputation on it, even without cost, actually did increase the perceived accuracy of the message, which was kind of neat. And if it was costly, it really increased the perceived accuracy, not only relative to the cheap case where you're just putting your reputation on, but also dramatically relative to the baseline case. There was one interesting, subtle nuance that if you warranted false information, that got perceived as more accurate too. So we need adjudication mechanisms to actually resolve that. But it's interesting that the signal on the source and the screen on the recipient has effect. Information economics does what you might predict it would do. There were some other interesting things in here. We had some what I thought were interesting, unexpected results that turned out quite useful. One of them is that what happened to engagement? It went up, not down. I don't know how many interventions actually caused engagement to go up, but in this case, the total number of headlines shared went from 7.8 on average to 9.4 on average. So engagement actually went up. Folks liked this option to be able to certify and pierce filter bubbles or actually share warranted information. Another thing, this was interesting and wonderfully surprising because it's not standard economics. It's really interesting from a behavioral economics perspective. Here, falsity is gray and true is blue. If folks were doing pure profit maximization, what should they have done? They should have shared but not warranted interesting false stories. They didn't do that. We speculate, we do not know. We speculate they kicked in more System 2 thinking than System 1 thinking, because they're actually really having to think about, do I want to do this or not? They forego 3 cents out of 25 that they could have earned by sharing and not warranting false information. They didn't do it. So we got a further reduction than standard economics would predict. And the discernment worked, whether it was Republican or whether Democrat. The effects actually worked. So this was the amount of false, this was the discernment among Democrats and Republicans, the discernment among Democrats and Republicans, and the discernment among Democrats and Republicans. And it seems to work across the board, regardless of category, regardless of your own prior on it. Stepping back, what were the 4 challenges that I gave you in the beginning? The arms race, discrediting the rater, shoe on the wrong foot, and costly structure. This one clearly changes the cost structure. It is now cheaper to tell the truth than it is to lie. It really does change the cost. If you want to reach an extra audience, you can do so, and it comes back. All right? So that's really the one big one on the cost structure. Also, it's really hard to discredit the rater. Who's the first party to rate? It's the author. The party creating the content is the first party. That's the shoe on the other foot question. So it makes it much cheaper to do it. The next party is going to be any decentralized peer group that you might sample from, making it very hard to discredit that particular group. It also gets away from the arms race problem because it's not a technological solution, it's a mechanism design solution. So that's a very different approach to it. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the last 2 points on this slide. By design, there is absolutely no central authority in any part of this. We're using Coasian ideas. There is no government. So it's not the platform, it's not government, it's not Musk, it's not Zuckerberg. No one is at the center influencing it one way or another. Exactly in a market, as in the choices of buyers and sellers to reach a Pareto optimum, these are the choices of speakers and listeners to try to reach a Pareto optimum. It's a new way of going after this problem. There's no central authority here. And notice there is no censorship at any point in any of this. You can reach any of your existing follower audiences with no friction at all. You're simply using this signaling mechanism to pierce filter bubbles for audiences that you would not have reached otherwise. In other words, go back to the expression earlier, do you have a right to speech but not to reach? This gives you the right to reach, conditional accepting liability for misuse of that right. No censorship at all. It's the choices of source and destination that lead to the outcomes in the equilibrium conditions. So what I've summarized for you is 2 separate papers. One of these is a theory. It's a different view on how we might go after this problem. That's this paper. It's the free speech and the fake news problem. The second paper is Truth is Warrant, the Impact of Self-Certification. That's the link in the program. That actually is the empirical evidence that perhaps this would work. Both are working papers. We would love your feedback on any of those things. The other papers actually are regulatory interventions that suggest what could we do as regulators that might actually make these things better. How would we reform Section 230 in the United States? How would we reform the DSA in Europe as other mechanisms to do that? So that's the content. At this point, I welcome any suggestions, any questions at all. Please give me your toughest expressions. We need to solve this. We need to find some answers to this. And if you've got better ideas, I am all ears. Would absolutely love to hear them.
Martin, that was a great presentation. I was just wondering if you've had, over here, just wondering if you've had any thought about Oliver Williamson's safeguarding. Particularly, there's a paper by Jones, Hesterly and Borgatti that suggested 3 social mechanisms, one based on reputation, one based on temporary suspension. But Williamson is a behavioural economist. He studied with Simon. I was just curious whether you've had any thought about the safeguarding idea as well.
I don't have it on the safeguarding idea specifically, but we actually have run some experiments about this mechanism compared to reputation mechanisms. And we actually found that this is somewhat more effective than reputation mechanisms for 2 reasons. One, so we tested it as fraudulent products in a marketplace as one example. And if you think of it as a market entry problem, if you're trying to enter the marketplace and you don't have a reputation, you have to build it up over time. And in a product case, you'd have to do it with discounts or what have you. With a mechanism of this sort, you can signal from the very start, the very beginning, that you think you're being honest, and you don't have to build a reputation. The other element of it is, again, as a product case, you could spend your reputation, and I've seen it happen on eBay. You'll get 10 great sales, then you'll have what looks like a great deal, and then you'll cheat and just quit the platform. Can't do that here, because you're putting your money where your mouth is on each and individual claim, so it's good from the beginning all the way to the end. So we did test it against reputations, and so far, the results came back better than reputation systems.
Hi, Marshall. Great presentation again. I just wanted to ask, for the purposes of this discussion, though, how do you define truth in the context of your framework? What happens when someone couches their view in opinion or, a question, for example?
So I love that question. I'm going to give you a multi-layered answer. The first answer to your question is you can't know truth, absolutely. If you can solve the halting problem in computer science, or you can actually abrogate the channel coding theorem by Shannon. So you can't know it absolutely. The thing that I would actually return the question to you is any adjudication mechanism, what you really want to do is to look at the weighted sum of false positives and false negatives. So you want to compare this against what the other alternatives would be. My proposal in this particular case is that you would use a randomized stratified sample pure jury, so it's hard to fabricate. And so your question then might be, truth versus opinion, or what you can actually have somewhere a spectrum in there. If you try to warrant opinion, I would assume the default would be you lose. You haven't warranted a fact, which would mean you couldn't impose your opinion on others. You go back to advertising to do that. So my argument is you'd probably want to go to a claim that is legal, so it's not terrorist recruiting information, it's not sex trafficking, it's not sale of illicit drugs. So that's legal, but also true, and then you're safe. If you're going to try to impose opinion, then I wouldn't allow that. You could change the defaults. That is an implementation detail. Again, I want to distinguish between, do you think this theory can solve the pollution problem, and what your specific version of an implementation would be. And I would hold you to the test, make sure whatever adjudication mechanism you're using, it has the best weighted sum of false positives and false negatives, and treat it that way.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, and thank you very much especially for putting the focus on the market mechanism, because I think this is a little bit what we have been missing in the debate. We have been discussing a lot about people's behavior, but very little about the market, and now it is the market that is encouraging actively disinformation, for example, in politics. Political advertising by the far right, who uses more outrageous content, is a lot cheaper than everybody else's political advertising. So this is super important. I don't think you need to adjust the Digital Services Act to do this, because Article 34 very specifically speaks about systemic risk to public discourse, and I think a market mechanism that encourages disinformation is very clearly a systemic risk. So I think we have a legal basis to implement something that goes in that direction. My question also goes in the direction, what does the adjudication mechanism look like? And you started answering this. I took notice. But I think if we live in a world that shifts towards situations where non-truth are more accepted by governments and at a certain point, and by those who control the digital platforms, than truth, how can an adjudication mechanism, which can't be a central authority, I totally agree, and it can't be a government, how can that work? People who try to establish only facts, not to speak, about opinion in terms of truth, but just scientific facts, are the objects of active harassment campaigns, which are a crucial instrument to keep this system working. The World Federation of Advertisers tried to find a system that could make sure they have some kind of brand safety so they don't see their ads on disinformation websites. And Elon Musk took them to court over it. People who have been doing research on this are being harassed. You mentioned speech but not reach. That's Renate Rester, who has been facing horrible consequences. So how can you have an adjudication mechanism in this world, in this system, where the most powerful people harass everybody who's trying to establish facts?
Wow, there's so many things in here. Let me see if I can address each one of them. So on the market mechanism, thank you, I totally agree. One thing we actually hope in the market mechanism, that this actually even works for trolls, because trolls know they're telling this, so we hope that it even works in that case. The next question is, I'm not quite sure that you could fully implement this under the DSA, because you have to grant the additional rights that we haven't yet granted. So those two rights I articulated, the listener's right to choose the filters and the speaker's right to be heard, we need to grant those rights. They could be granted either at the platform layer or the legislative layer. So I think we do need to do that. The DSA doesn't go far enough yet. The third question, and this one, let me go back to some of the benefits here on this slide. One of the things this mechanism does is it certifies the message and not the messenger. This separates from the reputation mechanism he asked about a moment ago. So this should protect whistleblowers, because now I can, if I want to actually make a claim, I certify the claim and I provide the evidence to it. I can be anonymous. So Rene DiResta can make a claim about what's going on, provide the scientific evidence about that, and pierce the filter bubble and not be personally held accountable. Notice, by the way, that still makes it difficult to lie, because if you're going to make false claims about someone's reputation, you can't defend it with actual facts, and you're still going to lose the warrant. Now, if I go back to your question, what's the adjudication mechanism? So I would start with what I suggested is a stratified peer random jury. That's one possibility. But the other way that you would be thinking about this is, which criterion are you optimizing? One of these is legitimacy, and the other is accuracy. If you're optimizing legitimacy, then you want to emphasize the peer jury so that people believe that due process has been had. To give you an example, in China, if there's a dispute on Taobao, then they will do a sample that includes merchants and consumers. So it's not all merchants or all consumers. That's the legitimacy aspect. But if you're emphasizing accuracy, then you may want to oversample among scientists, or better still, go with falsifiable hypotheses. Then you don't need a jury at all, and you can do it totally decentralized. So, for example, I don't care what the crowd votes as the coefficient of gravity. Anyone can drop an object and test it. That's a falsifiable hypothesis. Either is decentralized, which is the key criterion. We don't want a centralized mechanism. That's the essence. But then go back to your own issue. Are you going to maximize accuracy, or are you going to maximize legitimacy and tune your jury on those properties?
Very interesting. I have sort of the question starting with the sort of premises that you need for the Coase theorem to work. And one of them is that you don't have information asymmetry, and another one is the bargaining cost aspect of it. On the information asymmetry, I think what's clever here is that you're first asking the sender to make sort of a judgment, and that sender's obviously well informed. But I'm wondering whether you sort of thought through and made sure that this is robust when the sender knows a lot more at the time the sender sends about sort of the veracity of the information. And then secondly, I do think you will need here the platforms essentially to facilitate in some form or shape to make this really low bargaining cost and low cost for everybody to participate.
Yes.
And the most interesting result you had here is this engagement result you had, that you found that there was actually more engagement, which may make it attractive to the platforms to actually put such a mechanism in place. But I wanted to hear a little bit more of whether you have a sense for whether platforms would ever want to implement this, given also the prior comments about the existing platforms.
Lots of different things in your question. All right, for those of you economists, the Coase theorem effectively says that the market will be efficient so long you can assign property rights to either side, so buyer or seller, here, listener or speaker, and you'll get an efficient result so long as transactions costs are effectively low. In this case, so you need to assign the property rights to in this case, for the pollution, the lowest cost avoider. The lowest cost avoider in this case is the source rather than the destination. The other element of this is, because of the transactions cost, we are really in a bind. There's a paradox, because you can't use communication to negotiate over communication. So we have to use signaling and screening to do that, which is back to the information economics. So yes, we've tried to work through that. So we assign the liability to the low-cost avoider, which is the source. Now, your next part of the question. Would platforms want to do this? A key element of this is that users get to choose their own filters. A consequence of that is quite likely that a share of the ad revenue will go to the users themselves. So a Facebook and a Twitter and TikTok may not necessarily like this, but an entrant, Blue Sky, should love it, because this is a way to actually enter the marketplace. Users should appreciate it because they get to capture the revenue on which their attention is being sold. The resource that is sold is your attention. Now you get to allocate it, and you get the property right value of that asset. So yes, it is the case that the current folks whose externalities are polluting your asset will lose some of their market power. but it should be much more market efficient and much more beneficial to the users themselves who should prefer this solution, as my argument.
One last question.
Yeah, just had a quick one. Great, great talk. I love the externality angle. Sorry, here, Sander from Cambridge, here in the back. We did a study once where we paid people, gave them a financial incentive, and so it turns out people don't do so well in the task, true versus false, but then when you pay them, they actually know the answer, surprisingly, right? Because people share misinfo sometimes for social, political reasons other than not knowing the answer. But the big question, scaling that intervention, is who's going to pay for that to keep people accurate? And so my question to you is, you know, if I live in a neighborhood and some company is polluting my river, the onus shouldn't be on me to certify anything. The onus should be on the company to certify that the water is clean, that the rest of the community is using. Are social media companies going to pay people for rewarding accuracy and disincentivizing other types of content? Like who's going to, what's the mechanism that's going to distribute the payments without holding individuals responsible for the veracity of the content that they share, given that it should be on the owners of social media companies because it's their platform? Or are you putting, I guess my question is, are you putting the responsibility back on individuals in some way, or do you think the social media companies should be providing the incentive?
So I'm actually interested in your paper. I'm not familiar with particular work that folks get more accurate if you're paying them, so please send it to me. I'm interested in that. My prior work was on platform business model design. So we actually have a book on platform business models, and I actually think you could build a platform business model around this. A blue sky, I think, would be a wonderful illustration of this. What happened to the advertisers on Twitter once Elon Musk took over? He changed the filtration policies in ways that advertisers disliked, and a large majority of them left, so much so that he even sued a number of them. What happens if you give individuals the right to choose their own filters? They naturally segment into categories that are wonderful. So families might choose the Disney for their kids, which makes that useful. If you're selling hunting gear, that could be the guys that choose the Breitbart or the Fox filter. If you're choosing New York Times, maybe you're going to sell theater tickets. So in terms of the ad model, it gets even easier to do self-segmentation. And again, this doesn't get rid of the ad model. Anything that's an opinion, anything that's an ad in here, you're going to still use the traditional mechanism. It's only the case when you're trying to reach an audience with self-certified truth. So again, the whole point is not to put the burden on the recipient. You want the burden on the source. And though you will self-fund anytime you want to try to reach an audience that you would have been able to. So now I'm giving you a right you don't have. And if you want to use it, it's up to you. It's entirely your choice.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Amazing job. Thank you.
Thank you.